Like, well, you got a dipstick in your ass and you're just pulling, oh shit, I changed that much? What the fuck is going on? Stop that.
Welcome everyone to the video. Today I have as honored guests Dr. Jordan Grant and Broderick Chavez. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to this channel. I am Dr. Steven de Vos, the lifting dermatologist, and this is my partner Danny Bossa. If you want to learn more about the most cutting-edge science-based information in the world of hormone optimization, please like and subscribe. I also invite you to join my other YouTube channel, The Lifting Dermatologist. The link you can find in the description of this video.
We have a Facebook group called TRT and Hormone Optimization. In there we have Dr. Jordan Grant as a moderator. And it was his dream, I don't know, to interview you, Broderick. So there, we made it happen.
Yeah.
I find that mildly confusing and concerning, but nonetheless, proceed.
Yeah, it sounds worse than it is. No, I'm kind of a weird doctor in the fact that I've been into more bodybuilding stuff for a long time. And I guess it's been about 2.5 years I came across you through Mike Israetel stuff and started listening to everything I could. I think I first came across your interview with Lyle McDonald. It was like a two-part series on anabolics that I really loved it. So that's what kind of kept me listening, and I've been following you on Instagram and all that stuff. So the reason I wanted you on here is, we had Mike in the group, and he's talked about more of the exercise science type stuff. But we got a lot of guys who, they're not really into PED use as far as being bodybuilders, but we get questions all the time on PED use for health, which is kind of an oxymoron.
It is.
Yeah, and I agree with that, obviously, as a physician. As much as I would love for these things to be healthy, it's hard to advocate for that. But I think they ask a lot of good questions, and I thought it'd be nice to have you on just to kind of go over some basics of PEDs, maybe from a more non-bodybuilder perspective, just in general, how they work, androgen receptors. There's a lot of myths that get brought up that I try to squash as good as I can, but I don't know all there is about this stuff. So,
well, I'd venture to say I pretty much pain myself on a daily basis on the fact that I don't know all that there is, and I don't know nearly enough. But I'm happy to interject what I do know, or at least what I believe I know, and certainly what I apply in my daily acumen.
Okay, I appreciate it. Maybe just a brief intro as far as I know you do this on every video because I've watched them, but just for our listeners, just kind of how you got started early on in your career, just real brief, working out into PEDs and then coaching.
Well, interestingly, I've never really told that story in depth, and this is definitely not the time for it.
Yeah.
But, literally this very morning, I did a separate podcast. This is the second of the day. And in that one, I actually said some things that made me realize that's probably worth going back and clarifying one day. And what I said was my involvement in this was a combination of destiny and providence, in that basically from the womb, this is what I was going to do in terms of being a strength athlete. There was never a time in my memory or the memory of those around me that it wasn't painfully obvious I was going to lift weights and in some way be a speed strength athlete. That was understood. Was haranguing the adults around me at age 5 to allow me to lift weights. And the story I told kind of ties into it, but there's actually more to it than that. My grandfather, my father's father, was a professional wrestler, among other things. He was actually also a judo practitioner and one of the first Americans to hold a black belt in judo. But anyway, that's off point. But the moral of the story is, because of him, I had a very strong involvement in pro wrestling, which is an assortment of very large, muscular, presentation-based type physiques. Also, a lot of drug use. So, from essentially day one, I was already on the periphery of it, had an innate desire to do it. So every single action kind of providentially led to the next. And the next major moment was age 10. My birthday's early November. Christmas Day, 1981. My grandparents, who were essentially my parental figures, gave me a gift certificate to the local gym. And being the 10-year-old, and of course something that I had pested for almost the entire decade leading up to that, I'm waving this gift certificate around back in the days of actual paper, and I wanted to go to the gym, and they're like, it's Christmas. Nobody's in the gym. It's closed. Shut up. Finally, after enough haranguing, they let me go. Sure enough, the owner of the gym was actually there squatting Christmas morning. So the first day I walked into a commercial gym was Christmas Day, 1981. I squatted with the owner of the gym, who was actually a fairly renowned Olympic lifter in the Northeast of the United States. And again, to add a layer of that weird providence, I'm in the squat rack, never had done it per se, understood it innately because of my studies and what have you. But I'm standing in a squat rack, staring at a poster of Ken Patera in the bottom position of an Olympic lift, with those cheesy aviator sunglass type glasses he wore. But the catch is the poster was askew and held to the wall by 18-inch cattle syringes. 18-gauge cattle syringes were holding this picture. So essentially from the first moment, the course was chosen. The path was clear. And, now not to moderate or temper that a little bit, those people, that group of people around that gym were maybe a little bit intellectually limited, but prized the concept of intellectualism, prized the concept of, knowledge gathering. They weren't just, train hard. There was more to it. So from day one, I was simultaneously exposed to the idea that this is a hardcore endeavor, but I was simultaneously exposed to the idea of, and it's an intellectual endeavor. And that essentially launched the whole, work as hard as you can, learn as hard as you can, surround yourself with good people, which I had the opportunity to do, just again by kind of providence and chance. Dr. Fred Hatfield, Tom Platz, Tom Dieters, some really, really high-end performers and intellectuals, and wound up attending University of Arizona, got a degree in biology, essentially operated, I don't want to take credit that isn't due me, but I pretty much did all the diagnostics at the Human Performance Lab during my tenure there. So from day one, I was hands-on doing real work with real athletes. And I kind of had an extra sweet spot there in that my professor and the people actually running the Human Performance Lab were intellectuals with no ability to communicate to athletes. And the athletes were athletes and no way to intellectually communicate with the higher ups. So I kind of became a conduit between the pedigreed intellectuals and the pedigreed athletes.
Sure.
And it served me very, very well. And basically everything I know about coaching today, I learned in that little window of talk to an athlete, figure out what the hell they actually think, then turn and talk to the athlete or the intellectual and explain it in a way that makes sense, both ways.
Yeah.
Which is not easy, by the way.
No, I know that firsthand. So yeah.
And I don't like talking about myself, but along the way, I, moved to the national level in bodybuilding, the international level in powerlifting. Prior to some injuries that I sustained outside of the gym, well, not really outside of the gym, but secondary to weight training, I guess you could call it. I had probably one of the top 10 squats in the 220 class. I was very capable as a competitive powerlifter. I was a little bit lazy in the competitive aspect because I was more involved in the learning and training than the competing part. But I had about an 800-pound squat at 220. So I was pretty good.
So did you start kind of in your career getting involved more with performance athletes more than bodybuilders, I would assume?
Well, absolutely. Though I was a competitive bodybuilder and powerlifter, I went to University of Arizona, which was a very track and field centric school. So we were working ground level with basically speed strength athletes, 100, 200, 400 meter hurdles, triple jump, and then throwers.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. And then you kind of came to the bodybuilding side. I mean, obviously you're a bodybuilder, but that's been later on in life as far as helping guys with shows and
No, but it was definitely a sideline from the beginning. You know, the bread and butter, essentially the money was the actual athletes. But because I was who I was, had connection to the infrastructure of things, the pharmacological side of things, bodybuilders were kind of there on the periphery from day one.
Sure.
But then as now, bodybuilding's a bit of a sideshow circus. It's not really a sport. It's not really anything. I mean, I love it dearly. I really do. I don't mean to besmirch, but let's be fair. I mean, bodybuilding's a
pageant.
Somewhere between a circus and a pageant, and many times both.
Yeah.
It's not a sport by any stretch.
Sure. I agree. Well, we'll kind of get into, I had made a list of questions. I could talk to you about a million things. I was going to try and keep it more relevant to kind of our group. And I know how you feel about HRT guys and all that. I do. We try to be different because, well, I do at least. I know Stephen does. We try to stay as evidence-based as possible with this stuff.
Yeah.
Which is rare in a world with hormones.
Well, I trust you, and the sheer fact that you were recommended to me by Dr. Mike, who is a good friend of mine, and to in many ways, kind of my what's the word I want? Kind of my conscience. He whenever I'm posed with is something not a good idea, I usually bounce it off him. Yeah. So the fact that he has presented you guys to me as a valid, opportunity, I accept that. But what I was going to say is I kind of always cringe when I hear exactly what you said, because I hear that all the time from the CrossFit jackasses. Yeah. Like, oh, yeah, programming's a huge problem, CrossFit's a mess, but then they always, but not here.
Right.
They always, but not here. It's a systemic fucking problem the world around, but their little fucking 30-foot square, it's perfect. But it's fucking full of shit. But
yeah. No, I agree, and I feel the same way about CrossFit too. So I don't know. I'm a rare bird in this game, though, I'll be honest with you. And I'm just weird with this stuff. And I research this stuff as much as I can. There's not answers to all this stuff.
No, there isn't.
Unfortunately. And I wish, we could probably rabbit trail on that topic, but there's probably never going to be good studies on it because of the legality issues and all that, too. So,
well, I think, and this is off topic a little bit, but it's actually near and dear to my heart. There's very few people in this world that I take time out of my day, each and every day, to just hate, to just actively hate them. And Joe Biden comes to mind. I just actively take a moment out of each and every day to despise him. And the moral of the story is he's 1,000,000 years old. He's going to die soon. Whether or not that brings me pleasure is not really the point. The point is, time marches on. He will not be with us much longer. And with him, I suspect there'll be a bit of a passing of the guard. And the, reefer mania, paranoia of, PEDs is probably going to fade significantly. So I suspect, much like cannabis, THC, etc., with the changing of the guard, there'll probably be a loosening of the stigma. Unfortunately, I doubt you or I'll live to really see the butter zone of it, but I suspect another 50 years, my children, will be facing, andropause. Yeah. I have no male children, but nonetheless, but in principle, and the mindset will be considerably different. So I see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, but it's no help to us now.
Sure.
And just in case you don't know, you kind listeners, Joe Biden is 100% single-handedly responsible for the illegality of steroids. His little floppy liberal cock couldn't get hard in college, and so now nobody can have steroids. It's fucking horrible. I hate him with all of my black cardiomyopic heart.
There's it's a huge topic. At least the stigma, at least in the HRT, TRT world, has gotten less. I think it's become a lot more accepted, but there's still some horrible myths out there. The things patients will come and tell me that their primary care doctor told them or their cardiologist told them, you got to stop testosterone, it's going to give you a heart attack. And we know that's not true now. It's probably the opposite. Anyway.
Quite honestly, yeah.
So anyway, well, let me get into kind of some of the questions I had.
Sure.
Just basically, can you kind of give a rundown? And I know this, I've read Llewellyn's book. I mean, I kind of looked into this stuff, but for our listeners, just to, because I do see some guys get confused sometimes on the families of anabolics, the main three.
Yeah.
What are they? What are their? Yeah.
I don't know if I invented that or not, but I seem to be the only person presenting it that way. I don't think for a minute that I created it, but maybe I'm just particularly good at explaining, but that's the way I would lay this out. The start is, and I hope that you understand this, and I hope that most of your listeners understand this, but for a starting point, I think the first reasonable starting point is to say that testosterone is not an anabolic steroid. It is a steroid and it is anabolic, but it is by definition not an anabolic steroid, which is defined as a synthetic derivative thereof, therefore precluding testosterone. And if you were to buy a PDR or some other reputable document, you would look up testosterone and see that it is defined as an androgen. And if you were clever enough to maybe grab a Latin dictionary and look up androgen, you would find that it means to make male. So there you have it. What is testosterone? A steroid. And what does it do? It makes male. Okay. Notice I didn't say muscular or a big bench press or fertility. I said it makes male. That's what it does. So that's important. Now, from testosterone, the body can naturally convert via a concept called aromatization, an enzyme produced in adipocytes. It produces this enzyme. That enzyme cleaves testosterone at a given spot, creating estrogen and all of its associated derivatives. By the way, estrogen is a bold heading. It is not a thing. It is a lot of things. Most people lose track of that. There's esterol, estrone, estradiol. There's all kinds of estrogens. Okay. Even beloved tamoxifen is actually an estrogen. Okay. But anyway, secondarily, an enzyme produced in the liver called the 5-alpha reductase does exactly what it says. It reduces testosterone at the 5-alpha position, creating a new compound called dihydrotestosterone, which is a truncated testosterone that's taken on an additional hydrogen, i.e. dihydrogen. Okay. In a general sense, DHT is kind of evil, insidious stuff. Hair loss, prostate growth. In general, you don't need more of that. Okay. However, it's a wonderful substrate to then chemically alter and make really cool anabolic steroids. Pretty much all the fan favorites, Anavar, Winstrol, Primabol, and Masteron, the list continues, come from that. Okay. So we have this family tree of testosterone. We have DHT over here. We have estrogen over there. There are two other columns, direct chemical descendants of testosterone. Clever chemists take testosterone, tweak, twist, pull, augment, and make direct descendants of testosterone. Boldenone, dianabol, trinabol. There are some others. Those are the fundamentals. Okay. Second or tertiarily, yes, there's a third column called 19-nortestosterone, which in males does exist in incredibly small volumes naturally. In females, particularly gestating females, actually results in pretty significant amounts. And by the way, that's actually where it was discovered, in a urine of pregnant females. But 19-nortestosterone, again, I suggest, again, I wasn't joking about having a dictionary. Buy a fucking dictionary, look this shit up. Nor, in Latin, means without. So literally, 19-nortestosterone means testosterone without the 19 position. And if you took a moment to buy like the Idiot's Guide to Chemistry, you could identify the numbers in the couple of hexagons associated with the structure of testosterone. And if you counted around to the 19, it's not there. So it's testosterone minus the 19 position. That minor alteration in males actually happens via a spooky chemical process called hydrolysis. Literally means that a very small portion of that 19 bond dissolves in water. It just breaks from the chemical action associated with water. So you get body produces normal testosterone, water and heat act on it, a small amount loses the 19 position, you get this magical 19-nortestosterone. By the way, you may know it, friends and family, as Nandrolone. Okay. whether it be nandrolone phenylpropionate, nandrolone decoinate, there could be loads of other kinds, same stuff. So this 19-nortestosterone, that alteration makes it slightly less androgenic, slightly more anabolic, considerably less likely to convert to both estrogen and DHT, although the varieties of estrogen and DHT that it converts to are actually more potent per unit milligram than the original kind. So that's a little bit of a wash. And then it also has some slightly different progestinic actions because of the alternation. There's something called competitive antagonism with the progesterone receptor, which is an enormous rabbit hole I hope we don't go down.
And I was going to ask you, I was going to bring up the metabolites of nandrolone in a minute. Is there kind of and I know they don't all do the same thing, but as far as the families go, they're kind of good at their own things. I know there's outliers, Tren and the 19-nor families, not DECA. Anadrol may be a little outlier in the DHT family, but in general, are there certain things each family does well?
Yes, absolutely. You can, again, like a family tree, if the patriarch is red-headed, pretty strong indication that most of the, males in that family are going to have some tendency toward red hair, etc. We have that exact same thing in the family tree concept. Starting in the middle with testosterone and its direct derivatives. Testosterone is responsible for systemically, all of the morphological changes from an androgynous 10-year-old to a fully formed 20-year-old. Okay? Changes in musculature for sure, i.e. the anabolic capacity, but changes in behavior, changes in sexual development, sexual function, changes in neurology, coordination, skill acquisition. So it's a very blanket, let's call it broad spectrum effect. Lo and behold, every compound within that column is equally broad spectrum. Each one's a little tweaked, but in general, they're very general. You will get some size, some strength, some phlebotic influence, some neurological influence. They're very general. Also, by the way, the highest root conversion over to estrogen and DHT, like the original root molecule. You move over to the 19-nor family, you get more body weight. Notice I didn't say muscle or the douchebag bodybuilding.com size. You get more body weight retention per unit milligram partly because they're associated with gestation, partly because they tend to drive a bit more water retention, carbohydrate retention, glycogen synthase, creatine synthase, etc. So pretty much everything in the 19-nor family tends to drive more body weight per unit milligram. Can be good, can be bad. Moving over to the DHT side, you get exactly the opposite. They tend to drive the lowest body weight per unit milligram. Again, notice I didn't say muscle, I said body weight, because they tend not to drive the water retention, creatine, etc. You tend to only get protein expression, genomic protein expression. Therefore, I won't say all because that's wrong, but essentially all of the body weight gained is contractile tissue, whereas with nandrolone, you get the same amount of contractile tissue plus that much more other stuff. Yeah. So seemingly they're more powerful, but it's a matter of what are they powering. There's a big difference.
Okay. Is there the DHTs they intrigue me a bit. I've read the reason I guess they work because they're not broken down in muscle like DHT is.
Correct.
So do they have though a higher affinity, you think, for the androgen receptor versus pure DHT or lower? I've just been, from my perspective as a urologist, it always makes me wonder about prostate and all that.
Well, it's funny. I actually didn't realize you were a urologist because that's somebody actually just recently paid me pretty significant money to just dive into that topic. Oh wow! And I basically spent 3 months reading every goddamn textbook I could find on the topic, and it's interesting.
Yeah.
And I would be curious to compare notes sometimes because what I ferreted out doesn't seem to be what I'm finding in the dogma and application of medical science at late. But anyway, the whole concept of receptor affinity is very, very, 1, complicated, 2, very misunderstood, and 3, very narrow-minded. Okay, let's start with this. Definitely not the question you asked, but because the listeners may not have the acumen you and I do, let's start with this. Okay. Anavar was developed in the late 50s. Okay. It's impossible to believe that you have a receptor for a drug that wasn't developed until 1950. You have the same genes as your parents and their parents and so on. So people in the 1800s didn't have a receptor for a drug that didn't exist. Okay. My point is, every anabolic steroid and androgen we can name binds to exactly the same receptor. There be one. That might be a mild lie. According to the late Paul Borison, there might actually be some slight phenotypes within the receptor complex. There might be, for instance, an A, B, and C variety. But nonetheless, there's androgen receptor. End of story. There's no Anavar receptor. There's no Nandrolone receptor. Just androgen receptor. So if you use that childlike analogy of lock and key, every key is fitting into the same lock. Okay, that's important. So now we have this concept of receptor affinity. The problem with that is it's very narrow-minded. It's not one universal in terms of even with the same drug. For instance, we'll just pick a drug, and Anavar's been the topic. Anavar has a given receptor affinity for skeletal muscle, sure, but it actually has a different affinity for, say, SHBG, and potentially a different affinity for the receptors within the prostate, and potentially a different receptor affinity in the brain. So this is not homogeneous by any stretch. Okay, so that matters. Then secondly, receptor affinity is only a fraction of overall drug efficacy. There's also, for instance, binding constant, which is now the drug is bound. How likely is it to stay bound or unbind, move along and bind again somewhere else? What ideally you want is a drug with a high affinity but a low constant. It binds, signals, unbinds, tumbles down the line, binds again, signals, so on and so on, and it makes its way all the way through the circulatory system, and then the liver dismantles it, but it's bound, unbound, and activated cyclic AMP, therefore gene translation, 1,000 times along the way. Whereas a drug with a really high binding affinity and binding constant binds, signals, essentially you go to the elevator, you push the button, but then you stand in front of the door and don't let anybody in. That's not ideal. So this whole idea of binding affinity is a very narrow sliver of a much greater, more complicated pharmacokinetics of anything. Now, as far as the affinity of DHT derivatives, in a general sense, they are more anabolic per unit milligram than, say, testosterone, but they tend to have a lower binding affinity. Gotcha. But most of that's intellectual pedantics that probably doesn't really amount to much to the average user, because quite literally, the difference between swallowing one 10 milligram tablet and two 10 milligram tablets, it ain't a big bunch of fucking difference, nor is it much difference in risk.
Yeah. The reason I kind of am interested in it, and this is another topic I was going to bring up, but we can kind of combine the two, is a lot of guys talk about taking low dose DHT derivatives, with their TRT long term. And I've tried to look into this as far as any good studies on DHT derivatives and prostate weight, prostate health. There was one interesting one where they castrated rats and added back testosterone, and they gave something else. And basically the prostate, which they don't have a prostate, but whatever their
seminal vesicle,
seminal vesicle, it came back to the original size it was. So it didn't seem to, and I think they gave one testosterone, another one some DHT derivative. I don't remember what it was. It was interesting. So it didn't actually grow it any more than it already was. But in males, if they're taking testosterone, they're getting their DHT, it's being made in the prostate, locally. Well, then you're adding on top of that DHT-derived compounds. Is there an additive effect to prostate weight? I don't know the answer.
What I've come to, and this is a somewhat off topic, but what I've come to surmise out of the research that I've looked at, which is probably a considerably different body than you have, it looks like, again, something that most people don't understand is skeletal muscle is very plastic. It's a very plastic tissue, has the ability to change architecture on many levels. GLUT4 translocators, all sorts of things can come and go, made more, made less, etc. Myonucleation, all that stuff changes. Well, one of the other dynamic concepts is as androgen levels go up and as muscle mass goes up, the volume, the sheer number of androgen receptor, the AR number goes up. Okay. The problem is it's very easy to lose sight of tissue specificity. It appears, and again, no one's exactly done this study, but the indicators are there that the prostate is not nearly so plastic in that it has a fixed number of receptors and that's it. If that is the case, and I strongly suspect that it is, it's a sort of situation where any testosterone exposure is a risk, but the risk is the same at 100 milligrams as it is as 9,000 milligrams because there's a finite volume of uptake ability.
100%, and that's the saturation model that Morgenthaler has discussed. And,
correct.
And it plays out in real life. I've seen it with guys
Correct.
with testosterone. You castrate a man with prostate cancer, it will shrink it. You give him more than 150 nanogram per deciliter, it doesn't change it.
Exactly.
And I found the paper, it may not be the one you're referencing to, but about AR expression, because I was looking for the proof of AR upregulation because guys are, and we'll talk about that, are saying, oh, it doesn't happen. But I did see in the prostate, it was interesting, mRNA was upregulated for the AR, but the protein expression was downregulated. So it's basically a wash.
Correct.
So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there for guys. And while we're on the topic of AR upregulation, you'll find this, you'll appreciate this. A guy on the forum was saying his doctor told him he needs to constantly come in peaks and troughs and go to zero in his testosterone. Otherwise, he's going to burn out his androgen receptors. And I just told him that's not how it works. But I couldn't find a lot of good evidence on the upregulation of the AR.
Again, most of the research I'm referencing, or it's not even exactly research, and I'm not exactly referencing it, but most of the material in which I'm speaking about is comically what I always refer to as the commercial material, in that the Eastern European model of doing science was not the same as the rest of the world used. The rest of the world uses this, or at least in theory, uses this peer-reviewed model of, you have a hypothesis, you perform some tests, and then you let the public of pedigreed equivalents, evaluate it. The way Eastern Europeans did science was much more of what I would think of as a commercial model. The person in charge would take a chunk of money and put it down and say, this is how much you have to figure this shit out, go. And they would go to work. And there was no concept of debate. It wasn't a peer-reviewed model. They simply thought up a reasonably good test, tested it, and they said, here's what we found. Androgen receptors upregulate as dosage upregulates based on architectural changes associated with protein expression. And then the people in charge would take that and give it to the trainers and say, this is what we now know, go to work. Yeah. So comically, the Soviet, socialist model actually in science worked much more like a business. Yeah. And so there's, people always want these, peer-reviewed studies, and they don't exist. The stuff I'm referencing was ferreted out by the people winning. That's unfortunately what I got.
Yeah. Wow. So that is kind of the general, I agree, the consensus. You don't, because I guess this guy said the doctor told him, if ARs didn't, if they just continually upregulated, bodybuilders would keep growing forever. And I'm thinking that there's so many more layers to that than just the AR.
But as stupid as that statement is, that also verifies reality. We find that as bodybuilders take greater and greater dosages, they get bigger and fucking bigger. There's a linear line from, inception of steroids circa 1938 to today. They're linearly bigger. If you plot dose, it's shockingly similar.
Yeah.
So just the sheer fact that he would say that without any context is just a little embarrassing.
I agree. I told the guy he needs to have his doctor has to provide proof of that, or he's anyway. How about these guys that want to add, let's say, a low dose Masteron, Proviron, long term to their TRT? I've we've gone round and round on the forums with this. As a physician, I can't tell them that's healthy. I can't see a great need for it. A lot of guys like it for libido boost. It seems like, I found one paper where they did Proviron only, and the libido boost was there early on, and then it was lost, probably because you're shutting down the rest of the system. What do you think?
The very first thing I would say is, yes, DHT derivatives, in a general sense, tend to drive sexual function as much as libido, probably more function than actual libido. Libido is largely an estrogen-driven concept. But nonetheless, you do find solid sexual function under the influence of DHT derivatives. You also do find less body weight per unit milligram. So as you age, though I typically chastise people for, as soon as you're taking an anabolic steroid, you're no longer taking TRT, you're taking fucking drugs. I say that regularly. However, as you age, body weight and blood pressure become greater and greater concerns. So I could, in a curmudgeon state, acknowledge that as you age, reduction of testosterone and implementation of a DHT derivative, primobolanestaron, probably, I don't want to say makes sense, but it's not as problematic as it might first seem. Okay. Now, jumping sideways to the Provorin, I have a problem with that. Anytime somebody suggests that an oral anything is a long-term solution, they're fucking wrong. Yeah. They're just wrong. Those are the same idiots that in the same breath ask, well, what drugs do you take for liver health? Really? Let's deconstruct that statement, okay? If your liver is there to neutralize drugs, could adding a drug possibly ever help? Yeah. Ever? Yeah. I mean, I know it's just words, but fuck, that's all we have to communicate. That's what the fucking words mean, for fuck's sake. Yeah. So I don't disagree with the idea that a DHT compound could have additional benefits as one ages. Okay. Provorin's a terrible choice. Masteron's a better choice. And neither are desperately necessary. Yeah. But I could acknowledge it. And by the way, people love suppressing their binding globulin. That's such a favorite thing. Just, oh, well, it's more suppressive of my binding globulin. First of all, they can't spell that. Second of all, they don't know what it is. And third of all, they can't tell you why that's a benefit. So,
and that's something that I've looked into just recently, because I guess it's been just in the last probably 5 to 7 years, finding that SHBG actually has a function and binds to the megalin receptor. And there's you don't need to crush SHBG on purpose. Is kind of how. Well, I don't know.
No, first of all, people need to wrap their head around what the fuck it is. Why is it there? Why does it exist? What is its purpose? You ask the average musclehead, and they'll tell you something vaguely like, well, it binds up to free testosterone. All right, why? And now they're at a loss. Okay, in a very generic, generalized sense, this is how it works. Okay, in the most healthy model, again, something most people don't understand is hormone production, whether it's insulin, growth hormone, testosterone, adrenaline, etc., is a binary concept. There's not a valve like the faucet on your sink where you can turn it on a crack and just get a dribble. It's binary. It's either fucking on or fucking off. That's it. Okay? That's how testosterone production works. 100% production or 100% cessation. There is no middle ground. Now, that means that even in the most tightly regulated system, you are going to get protuberances. You get 100% production, you cross a threshold, you get cessation, you get diminishment, suppression, and then so you get this oscillating sine wave within a narrow band that is your average testosterone. Sure. Okay. Binding globulin serves the purpose of, during those brief moments of overproduction, it gobbles up the difference, holds it in cache like a time release mechanism, and then due to something called protein turnover rate, basic protein lifespan and decay, it releases or dribbles out and rains out that extra. So this idea that somehow binding globuline's bad for your progress is retarded. All it's doing is buffering the time from production to release. It's not stealing it. It's not running off. It's not turning it into fucking Easter eggs. It's just slowing down the metabolism of this hormone.
Yep.
Well, that's a good thing, because all these people that are so worried about microdosing and this and to try and get even levels, you know where even levels come from? The fucking binding globulin. Jesus Christ, Allah be fucking merciful. It's phenomenal that people allowed to have sharp, pointy shit have that little understanding of what's going on inside their own person.
I love it. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a big topic especially in the TRT world, is SHBG every day. And most of us in the group, I mean, have been saying stop worrying about your SHBG all the time. Stop trying to crush it all the time. I see in the lowest digits I see are in obviously diabetics, insulin resistant people, but also people taking oral steroids that seem to crush SHBG into the single digits pretty often.
Yep.
So I can't condone that.
By the way, insulin is actually the major controller in a normal non-enhanced individual. Insulin is the major moderator of SHBG.
Right.
And it's actually, again, right in my sweet spot of expertise, being a biologist. This is how it works in nature. Springtime happens, okay? Food sources go up. With food sources goes calorie consumption. With calorie consumption goes insulin. Insulin suppresses binding globulin, making momentarily an additional wash of free androgens, which tends to drive mating, because it's a good idea to make the babies when the food is available. You see the whole circle. It's a donut, dare I say, of life, a very carbohydrate-laden donut of life. Environmental calories go up. Environmental calorie consumption goes up. Binding globulin goes down. Momentary androgens go up. Mating ensues. Calories to feed baby. Baby survives.
Yeah.
Nature has a way of doing things, I don't know, naturally, I would say.
Right. And I think when we start throwing too many variables in, because I'm a minimalist with TRT, and I think you start trying to manipulate all these things, you're already doing something that's not natural by giving an exogenous hormone. And then you start trying to manipulate every other thing, and the body doesn't like it. So let me ask you real quick about Nandrolone, because we get asked all the time about low-dose DECA in addition to TRT for healing joints. And just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Once again, it's one of those things that's real, but probably on a practical level, completely and totally irrelevant and outside of the demographic which you're speaking. Nandrolone in general is associated with gestation. Because of that, it is a progestin. Because of that, it tends to have slightly superior protein expressive capacities for colloids, connective tissue, joint tissue, etc. Because unlike testosterone working in a grown adult, where you're working on a grown adult, in gestation, you're working on an ungrown creature. So you don't just have to grow muscle tissue or bone, you have to grow everything. So it's a slightly more broad spectrum genomic expression. Makes sense on a level that people don't take the time to work out, but nonetheless, the catch is in scale to body weight, working on a 100-gram, incubatory fetus versus working on a 100-kilogram active adult, the scale is not there. The 50 to 100 milligrams they think is going to have some influence is not.
Gotcha.
Now, in my world, where you have world-class strongmen that weigh 150 fucking kilograms, yes, the 800, 1,000 milligrams they're taking might actually have a moderating effect on their joints. It's believable, but it's still nominal, and it has nothing to do with the scaled-down version of TRT guy.
Gotcha. Okay. And I was always just confused whether the Nandrolone was helping with pain control, like masking joint pain, or actually doing something to heal it. And I didn't know.
Well, it seems to have, there are a number of awkwardly designed, quirky studies that show that it does have a slightly superior protein expressive effect on colloids, which are what that joint material is made out of.
Yep.
So extrapolating, which can be dangerous, it suggests that equidosings, testosterone versus nandrolone, you might see slightly more anabolism within the connective tissue, therefore joint repair preservation.
Gotcha.
The one thing I think, and this is an opinion, and I try very, very hard to separate out what I learned in a textbook versus what I think. This is an I think. I think an awful lot of the magic and or even negative effects of steroids, assorted steroids, is misinterpretation of reality. I believe that the nandrolone thing is one of them. I do think that using nandrolone tends to alleviate joint pain. However, I believe it's a misinterpretation of the facts. Nandrolone, on top of its colloid actions, has an even stronger water retentive capacity, cell swelling capacity. I believe what's really happening is it's having an action within the bursal compartment, causing some sort of swelling, some sort of edemic capacity, which pads the overall joint, therefore making the joint more stable, potentially more lubricated, and so you get a release of frictional problematic issues. It's not really a repair, it's almost a side effect of the action of the drug.
Yep.
Now, can you use that to your benefit? Of course you can, but it's also a misinterpretation of what's going on.
Sure. Yeah. It's in practical matters, it doesn't matter, but when you get to the nitty gritty, it's nice to know why. So
at the end of the day, under the hood shit does matter.
Absolutely. Since we're on the topic of nandrolone, I wanted to ask you about and it's controversial. Anyway, I won't get into it, but the nandrolone, high dose nandrolone only cycles.
Yep.
What is your, I mean, I know that's not even a question. And you don't like that.
Well, no, it is. You're right. Grammatically, it's not a question.
Yeah,
but in practical context, yes, it is. Okay, start with this. Okay, first of all, people act like their time is the only time that ever existed. People forget that history has been going on since, well, the beginning of history. The use of testosterone in any way, shape, or form, whether it be for TRT or for sports purposes, is a new phenomenon. Many of the classic physiques that everybody so loves to love, the Arnold, the Zane, those sorts of people, you know how much testosterone they took? Fucking zero. None. They scoffed and laughed at testosterone. It was not a thing that they took. Okay. So right out of the gate, this inherent reliance and clinging to testosterone is wrong and childish. Okay. Secondly, from the late 60s through the mid-1980s, the United States had, and again, you should be well aware of this being a medical doctor, had prescribable HRT therapy. H being the key word, not T as in testosterone, but H as in hormone, and the hormone of choice was nandrolone. Nandrolone was prescribed as hormone replacement therapy for millions of Americans from the mid-60s to the mid-80s.
Right.
The reason it was not continued is because it didn't fucking work very well. Yep. So we can ask my opinion to the end of time, but the collective opinion of the medical community and the millions of people that were subjected to that is, it's shit.
Yep. Yep.
So I'll default to them and say, it's shit.
That was my biggest, I kind of got into it on the forum with a guy, mainly from the health side of it. You know, I'm not debating that it works for bodybuilding purposes, any of that. It's more that we need testosterone for the derivatives from testosterone. There are studies on nandrolone, probably more than a lot of other anabolics, as far as maybe some concerns about the heart and renal tubules. And my concern, and it's something you brought up with Lyle McDonald on the Alex Kickel podcast about estrogen, which is awesome. And I hammer this all the time. The derivatives, the metabolites from nandrolone or boldenone or dianabol, the estrogen metabolites, they are not 17-beta estradiol. They 100%. Are, so from nandrolone, you're getting a 19-nor estrogen. And how those affect us from a health standpoint, I don't think we really know. And that's a big deal.
100% it is. It is in a way that the average person just can't grasp.
Yeah.
You know, people love to compartmentalize. and it doesn't raise my estrogen as much, or it doesn't this, or it doesn't this, something. But I'm like, what about these other 9 things? What's it doing to your blood lipid profile? What's it doing to your arterial plasticity? What's it doing to your, renal numbers? What's it doing to ion gradients? There's so many things, and just one of them can ultimately trigger some downstream event that leads to fucking death, a stroke, infertility, all sorts of things, birth defects. People love to compartmentalize in a way that's it's embarrassing. Actually, it's just not how the real world works.
Yeah, and it's been fascinating to me to learn this stuff. And Lyle brought it up. There's actually no good paper I could find on specifically Nandrolone and its estrogen derivative, but there was a Nandrolone derivative paper, and I believe those estrogens were made in the liver. It wasn't just from aromatase, and they were vastly different. It was very interesting. Almost some of them resembled female birth control, which progestin makes sense. So I just want guys to realize that that's what you're getting, and you're also not getting DHT. You're getting dihydronandrolone. So
correct.
It has its own issues.
It has its own entire life of its own. Absolutely. And again, people just don't understand that stuff. And I think that's kind of one of the problems with the Provorin kind of losing its efficacy over time is you're not really talking about DHT. It's an analog at best.
Right. And that's something and that's why I brought up the androgen receptor signaling earlier. I was just curious, do we know how those different non-bioidentical compounds, are they affecting something just at the receptor level? Is it a non-receptor mediated thing?
The theory, and again, I got to connotate this. I've had conversations with some of the top experts in fucking niche fields. For instance, the late, great Paul Borison spent his entire life essentially just studying sex hormone receptors. That was his entire graduate work. All he did was study the behavior and dynamics of sex hormone receptors, mostly for the birth control world. But androgen receptors played into that, partly because at the time there was a big push for male birth control.
Right.
And in his opinion, and I tend to abide by this because it's the most rational concept I've ever heard, is if you think from an analogy point of view, instead of the childlike lock and key scenario, think of a computer chip, okay? A block of silicone with an assortment of pins sticking out of the back. And those pins click into a socket, which is much more like what we have in a receptor drug concept. And then if you think more mechanically, the pins insert into little grooves or something, and at the bottom there's a pressure plate. Okay. Now, if clever chemists or just biological chemistry came along and altered that computer chip, kind of extended a couple of pins, clipped a couple off, you would change the conductivity, as it were. So when it clicks in, it doesn't make the same level of contact with the pressure plate everywhere. So some things are tenuous, maybe some things are not contacting at all, some are really fucking contacting. And that, on a receptor level, is the beginning, not the whole story, but the beginning of the changes. So the actual message is slightly different based on pressure conductivity. So then that's transmitted via cyclic AMP from receptor to nucleus. The nucleus then does some sort of calculus that we don't fucking understand at all, then decides what blueprint needs to be sent genomically out to the ribosomes, which is then transmitted via cyclic AMP. Then the ribosomes make some sort of calculus and start making whatever they think is on that blueprint. So you've got many, many opportunities for the story to slide sideways.
Yeah.
And that's roughly what we've got.
Okay.
So alterations to the molecule alter the message, then the message itself can alter, the understanding of the message can alter, and then the sending of the message to the actual manufacturer could alter.
Okay. I think that's important because a lot of guys, and I've heard this from even some bodybuilding coach type guys, that, you just need to stimulate the receptor. It doesn't matter what compound it is.
Well, that's fucking retarded. Why would there then be altered different compounds?
That's my question.
That's dumb in a way that's hard to even explain.
Yeah, I agree. I said the same thing. So I'm going to probably wrap it up just because I had a bunch of other questions, but I think we could do a whole nother topic on, I was going to talk about metformin and low carb and high carb. I think that could be a whole nother video. So, yeah.
Yeah, like I said, all due difference and respect to you and your partner, but I went into this blind with some, trepidation, but this went super smooth. I'm happy to come back and talk about whatever you like.
Yeah, I mean, just because there are a lot of, people ask about metformin for longevity, and then there's a lot of the low carb zealots, and I'm not a low carb guy, and I think a lot of that stuff's important to hash out. Insulin's not evil. I mean, all these topics that get thrown around that,
No. Probably the most valuable thing any of your listeners could do is literally stop trying to be so smart. And I don't mean that, in an embarrassing, besmirchful kind of way, because I look really clever doing this, but I can't balance my checkbook. I can't get a cup of coffee without a train wreck. Like, I'm really good at this and really bad at everything else. So I basically feel that everyone else should be the same. And that they would be bad at this and good at something.
Yeah,
so my point is this: if people really want to learn this stuff, they should literally start with biology. Like, literally, I'm not joking. Buy the Idiot's Guide to Biology and understand a cell, understand a nucleus, understand a Krebs cycle, understand just really photosynthesis, just really, really basic, leg bones connected to the hip bone kind of shit. Yep. And once you understand that, it's kind of like once you understand economy, your investments make a much different sense. Once you understand, who has the money and how it works, you start to use yours differently. And I think that's where people go wrong, is they're jumping in at the, the roulette table, and they don't even know they don't understand the fucking game.
Right.
And I'm, rather privileged to have been brought up from ground level and, have learned all these intermediate steps. So yeah, momentarily I look like a wizard until I go over to the investment side of things, and I'm a retard. So I think people need to do the same. Is if they really have an interest in this, they need to fucking just own up to the fact that they probably don't know, and they probably need to start at the bottom.
Yep.
I think that would serve them very, very well.
And I like to pass that message on to other physicians who are, let's say, prescribing hormones and don't know anything about it. And they need to, if you're going to do it right and learn about it, or don't do it. It's the
Absolutely.
same thing you're saying. So
yeah, very, very much so. And I don't invest my time in the whole TRT, HRT world, but boy, could I get on a soapbox and talk about what I think is pretty wrong with that world. Yeah. I really could.
Yeah, it's a huge world. So yeah,
yes.
I agree. I come at it more from a urologic standpoint, so it's not from the.
And then there's a second part of that too, is and I want to put on a good podcast and make everybody excited and then piss on everyone at the end. But
that's okay.
I kind of feel the same way about the TRT world as I do about the natural bodybuilding world. Right. Is it attracts a specific personality, a specific phenotype that they're just notoriously hard to deal with, hard to get through to, and hard to convince that they're living in a fucking fantasy. I always hear this shit like, oh, well, I changed my dosing pattern from once a week to twice a week, and I got 2% better. And then I went from twice a week to 3 times a week, and I got 18% better. I'm like, you're just making that shit up. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? You just stop that. Like, well, you got a dipstick in your ass and you're just pulling, oh shit, I changed that much. What the fuck is going on? Stop that.
I love it. Yeah, you're right, because we deal with that every day. And I'm, like I said, I'm a minimalist. I do 1-2 times a week injections just to keep things stable. But if a guy feels better doing daily, that's his business. But after a certain time, you're at steady state, and you're probably not.
100%. That's, I'm pretty sure the chemists that put this shit together had at least enough, acumen to get that right.
Yeah. So I do understand your frustration with that world. And I feel that way about the bodybuilding world too, not on your side, because that's why I was so attracted to everything you did, because it wasn't just this forum crap where people are just spewing myth left and right and hurting people, I think, honestly.
Probably. Yeah. Well, and I think I sensed a certain amount of frustration on your end. Is I avoid that world to a frightful degree. Like, I don't post shit on my own Facebook page, just because I just find it annoying, obnoxious, and largely just a waste of time.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, I appreciate you coming on and doing this with us.
Sure.
Okay, guys, this was awesome to listen to. I really didn't have anything to ask. Jordan did it all for me, and I know he still has a lot of other questions for maybe next episode. Thank you so much, Broderick.
Thanks, Broderick.
Thanks, Jordan. See you next time.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
I'll see you later.